Nobody on your television screen tonight is going to say what I'm about to say. Not on the big networks, not on cable, and definitely not from anyone inside Washington. What happened this week wasn't just a foreign policy setback. It was a self-inflicted wound. And the person who actually pulled the trigger, he wasn't sitting in a government building in Tehran. He wasn't in Beijing. He was in Tel Aviv. I'm Olivia Reed. This is ClearFrame. And tonight we're going to walk through exactly how the United States backed itself into a corner it may not be able to get out of. Why a blockade announced as a show of strength is already functioning as a display of weakness. And who is quietly benefiting from every single miscalculation being made in Washington right now. Stay with me. This goes deeper than the headlines. Within hours, the president was on television announcing a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, the same strait that he had spent 6 weeks demanding Iran reopen. His answer to Iran's not opening the waterway was to close it further himself. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The logic being applied here is, we want this door open, and since they won't open it, we're going to padlock it shut. That is not a geopolitical strategy. That is a man locking himself inside a room and then announcing he's won. But here's the piece of the story that I haven't seen reported clearly anywhere. And this is the part that reframes everything. The Islamabad talks didn't fall apart because Iran stonewalled. They collapsed because the American negotiating team arrived carrying a demand that was never going to produce an agreement. It was structured, whether intentionally or not, to fail. Here's what the vice president's team pushed as their central condition: the complete and total elimination of Iran's uranium enrichment program. Every centrifuge was dismantled. Every gram of enriched material surrendered, handed over to the United States. Every gram of enriched material surrendered, handed over to the United States. Now, here is the context that absolutely matters. Iran has maintained a domestic uranium enrichment program under international law, specifically under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for decades. The 2015 agreement, which Washington negotiated, which international inspectors verified was being followed, capped Iran's enrichment well below weapons grade. It was working. Then, in 2018, the United States walked away from that deal, tore it up. And now, years later, Washington returned to the table not to restore what was lost, but to demand something even more sweeping than the agreement it destroyed. Ask yourself a straightforward question. Whose agenda does that demand actually serve? Because getting the Strait of Hormuz open, that's an American interest. Cooling down oil markets before an election cycle, that's an American interest. Stopping the economic bleeding, that is an American interest. But eliminating every trace of Iran's enrichment capability completely? That is an Israeli priority. That has been an Israeli government talking point for over a decade. And here's where it gets impossible to ignore. While the vice president was inside that hotel trying to reach an agreement, the Israeli prime minister went on camera and publicly stated that the campaign against Iran was not finished. His words, on record, while American diplomats were in the midst of negotiations. The American negotiating team is in a room trying to end something. America's closest regional ally is on television saying it should continue. And while those talks were happening, Israeli military operations in Lebanon continued. Buildings destroyed, hundreds of civilians were killed. And before the talks had even started, Iran submitted one written precondition: a ceasefire across the region, including Lebanon, before any agreement could be finalized. So let me state this plainly. Iran said, "Stop the bombing and we'll talk." The bombing continued. The talks collapsed. Washington blamed Tehran. Those talks weren't lost. They were broken before they began. And the fracture didn't come from the Iranian side of the table. Now let's talk about the blockade itself, because even setting aside how we got here, the policy has 5 structural problems that exist completely independent of politics. These aren't opinions, these are conditions on the ground. Iran has lived under American-led economic pressure for 47 years. Not 5 years, not a decade, 47 years. Sanctions, isolation, restricted access to global banking. None of it broke the Iranian government. 6 weeks of military strikes didn't break it either. Now look at what happened to America the moment the blockade was announced. Oil prices shot above $140 a barrel. Energy analysts started warning about a shortfall of over 10 million barrels of combined crude and refined products removed from global markets simultaneously. And consumer confidence in the United States just hit its lowest recorded point in the entire history of the University of Michigan's long-running economic survey. Not since 2008, not since the pandemic, the lowest ever recorded. And that was before the blockade officially began. Iran's parliament speaker responded by posting a photograph of gas prices near the White House with one line of text. He said Americans would soon miss paying $4 per gallon. He's not wrong. In an endurance contest between a country that has trained for decades under pressure and a country that hasn't, you don't need to guess who outlasts who. The White House suggested Britain would send minesweepers to support the blockade. London said no. Australia's Prime Minister said his government wasn't even consulted, calling it a unilateral American move. NATO has not endorsed it. The European Union has not endorsed it. Not a single Gulf state has committed vessels or logistical support. Meanwhile, more than 40 countries are quietly building a separate diplomatic framework to reopen the strait through negotiation. 40 nations are working around the United States, 0 working with it. That's not leadership projecting from a position of strength. That is a country watching its coalition evaporate in real time. China's defense minister issued a public statement. Chinese commercial ships and naval vessels are moving through the Strait of Hormuz. China will honor its existing energy agreements with Iran. And he warned in careful but completely clear language against any outside interference in China's bilateral trade relationships. Let me translate that from diplomatic language into plain speech. China told the United States that its ships are going through and dared Washington to do something about it. And those ships aren't just passing through. They're paying Iran in Chinese yuan, not dollars. The financial infrastructure of this region is being quietly reconstructed, and it's not being built around American currency. There's one more piece to this that should stop you cold. American intelligence has confirmed that China is preparing to deliver air defense weapons to Iran, systems capable of targeting aircraft. The same category of weapon has already been used to bring down American fighter jets during this conflict. The president confirmed this himself. So walk through the logic. China is supplying weapons that are killing American pilots. China is sailing ships through a waterway the U.S. claims to control. And China's defense minister is publicly challenging Washington to respond. What does the U.S. Navy actually do when a Chinese-flagged tanker approaches the blockade? Board it and risk armed confrontation with a nuclear-armed military? Sink it and commit an act of war against the world's second largest navy? Or stand aside and let the entire world watch the blockade dissolve into theater? And there's a longer consequence nobody in Washington appears to be thinking through. If the United States establishes the legal and strategic precedent that a naval power can blockade an international strait, China will use that exact framework, word for word, to justify blockading Taiwan. America would be handing Beijing the blueprint for the one action it has spent 70 years trying to prevent. Iran's senior military advisor stated publicly that the country has, and I'm using his exact phrase, great untapped leverage available. That isn't posturing. That is a reference to a specific geographic reality. Iran's regional partners in Yemen control the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern entrance to the Red Sea, a choke point through which somewhere between 12 and 15% of all global trade moves every single day. If Washington closes Hormuz, Tehran picks up the phone. The Red Sea closes too. You now have two of the most critical maritime passages on the planet shut simultaneously. Oil doesn't become expensive, it disappears from the market. Fertilizer shipments stop. Food supply chains fracture across multiple continents. The conversation stops being about recession and starts being about something far worse. America is playing on one board. Iran is playing on two. And the second board contains a piece that American military power cannot reach. Russian oil does not flow through the Strait of Hormuz. Every barrel trapped in the Persian Gulf is a barrel the global market needs to replace from somewhere else, and that somewhere else is Moscow. Before this conflict escalated, Russia's oil revenues were declining. The Kremlin was internally preparing for budget reductions. Then the war started. Russian oil tax revenue doubled to $9 billion in a single month. A blockade on Hormuz pushes prices higher still. Russia earns more every single day the blockade holds. Here is the detail that deserves far more attention than it's received. During this conflict, the White House lifted sanctions on Russian oil, citing the need to keep global energy prices manageable, and then announced a blockade that pushes those same prices back up. The combined effect is that Russia is selling more oil at higher prices with American permission. The country whose satellite intelligence reportedly assisted Iran in targeting American military assets is being financially rewarded by the same administration that says it's winning this war. If someone submitted that as a plot outline for a political thriller, it would be rejected for being too far-fetched. Here is the pattern underneath all of this. Every significant move in this conflict has followed the same arc. Action intended to create leverage. Leverage that instead generates cost. Cost absorbed by American families at gas stations, American pilots in the air, and American credibility in every diplomatic room around the world. The war enriched Russia. The ceasefire window strengthened Iran's position. The Islamabad talks revealed in real time who actually sets the conditions for American foreign policy. And this blockade will teach a watching world exactly where the ceiling of American power sits, and that it can be found by anyone willing to walk up to it and push. There was a version of American power that didn't need blockades to be believed. It didn't need ultimatums shouted from cable news. It didn't need divine self-imagery or threats to civilian water supplies. It ran on something quieter and more durable. The credibility that comes from saying what you mean, doing what you say, and understanding that real strength never needs to announce itself this loudly. That credibility is what's actually being blockaded right now. Not a strait, not a waterway, America's word. I'm Olivia Reed, this is ClearFrame. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening beneath the surface, share it and come back, because the next story goes further than this one did.